Okay, I'm going to talk about chapter 15, which is the the Civil War. And I know our slides say Civil War and Reconstruction, but we're gonna stop at the end of the Civil War here, and we'll do Reconstruction over chapter 16. Okay, so after seceding from the Union, the Southern states began seizing federal property in the South. They take forts, they take whatever, and Fort Sumner in Charleston Harbor is the last one of the last federal possessions um, remaining in the South. And by 1861, things are bad. Rationings are starting to run short. There's not heating fuel. Buchanan authorizes a relief expedition to supply the troops, and the South opens fire on it, and it withdraws. Right, Fort Sumner is still under siege when Lincoln takes office on March 4th, and Lincoln tries to reinforce the fort. Right, the South doesn't want them to. Um, we have that. The South sends a delegation to Washington, D.C. to sign a treaty of peace and to buy the forts from the North, basically um, asking the North to recognize the South as its own country. Lincoln rejects this idea because he doesn't believe the South has the right to leave the Union, and therefore it's not its own country. On April 4th, Fort Sumner's lack of supplies becomes very critical. Lincoln orders resupplies to be sent. On April 12th, the Confederates open fire on that resupply ship, which turns around, and then they open fire on Fort Sumner. Right, the fort is the fort is ultimately surrendered, and on April 14th, Lincoln declares the Confederate States in a state of rebellion. Right, and so he calls. Let's see where we are. Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops to come up and put down this rebellion. And when he does that, you have additional states that leave the Union, right? The first battle of the Civil War is going to be the Battle of Bull Run. If you're from the South, it might be called the Battle of First Manassas, right? It's fought on July 21st of 1861 in near the city of Manassas. The North is going to name battles based on rivers that are nearby, and so the Bull Run River. The South is going to name it on nearby towns, thus the Battle of Manassas. Right. The Union troops were under the leadership of General McDowell, who felt political pressure to attack the Confederacy there at Manassas Junction. And the fight breaks out in early July or mid July, I suppose. And the Union's very successful in the early parts of this skirmish as the Confederates reinforce using railroads. Thomas Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, arrives on the scene and rallies the troops in the middle of the Confederate line that ultimately turns the tide of the battle. The Union troops panic and begin a unorganized retreat back to Washington, D.C., and things kind of fall apart. Right, here's a battle map. You have that. Okay. One of the interesting things about the Battle of Bull Run is the fact that it was kind of advertised when it was going to take place in the newspapers. And so a lot of people, or as the troops left Washington, a lot of the citizens in Washington, D.C. decide that they're going to visit the battleground and watch it take place. And so you actually have picnickers on the battlefield. You have people and just enjoying a Sunday picnic and the Civil War battle breaking out along around them. Like there's a very real disconnect about the realities of modern warfare in the 1860s, what people thought warfare was going to look like versus what it actually was. Okay, so we have that. Both the North and the South start the war with relatively small navies, right? One of the things that they do to compensate for this is they both build Ironside warships. The most famous for each group is going to be the Confederate States the Manassas, and the United States is going to have one called the Monitor. By the end of the war, the North is going to have a large superiority of ships over the South. And the primary focus of the Northern Navy really is a couple fold here. Like they want to blockade southern ports. Like they're going to try to prevent cotton from leaving southern ports. They want to prevent goods from coming in from Europe to reinforce the South. And then ultimately, they're going to try to support the Army with gunships and transportation and those types of things. We have a picture here of the Manassas and the Manassas here and the Monitor where they meet, right? The blockade is part of a overall war strategy called the Anaconda Plan, which is supposed to close the ports of the South to prevent supplies from coming in. By the end of the war, there's going to be over 500 ships working on this blockade. To begin with, the blockade was relatively unsuccessful. They would catch about 10% of blockade runners. By 1865, almost no goods are coming into the South. And so it's a gradual tightening of that blockade and of that Anaconda Plan. It was put in place by Winfield Scott, who was the one of the main generals of the Mexican-American War, and he believed that because the southern states, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and so forth, Winfield Scott believed that when these states left the Union, they took with them a lot of the nation's military commanders. Because in the South, one of the occupations of a gentleman would be a military general, and so a lot of the command structure of the United States military left. A lot of the soldiers of the military left as well. And so Scott was like, hey, we're not prepared to fight a large-scale war at this time with the South. And so one of the things we have to do is we have to buy enough time to strengthen our armies in the North. And so this blockade, which was supposed to, cut the South in half, or cut the South, keep things from coming in, and then up the Mississippi River was put in place. Okay, the United States only has about 16,000 troops. Many of them are Southern. Most of the Southern officers most of the officers are going to be Southern, and a lot of them are going to resign their positions and join the Army of the Confederacy. Examples of these people would be like Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, Jeb Stuart, are all going to do that. And so Lincoln calls for the states to raise about 75,000 men for a 3-month term to put down this rebellion of the South. And when he does this is after Fort Sumter. After Fort Sumter takes place, Lincoln asks 75,000 troops to come back, and this causes 4 more states to leave the Union: Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee. We have that. After the first battle of Bull Run on July 22nd, Lincoln calls for 500,000 more volunteers. And these two numbers were originally met very easily with volunteers. These are either abolitionists looking to fight against the ideas of slavery, or they're immigrants coming to America looking for money. One of the things that the Northern Army does is it welcomes new immigrants and gives them land. If you sign up for the Army, you're automatically given like homestead land in the American West. And so a lot of immigrant families would come over, and they would have family members serve in the military and take advantage of that, which works out pretty well because, like, if as long as you make it through the war, you got a farm on the end of that. Okay, by 1863, as the war drags on and casualty rates raise, volunteers are harder to find, and so the North creates something called the Enrollment Act, which is the military draft. It requires every citizen and male immigrant between the ages of 20 and 45 to enroll for the draft in the Army, right? You could be exempt from this if you could pay a $300 fine or a $300 fee basically to get out of your military service. That's about the equivalent of about, I don't know, $40,000 in 2025, right? And so rich people could find a way to avoid military service. Because of this and because of practices that some people found unfair or even just unfavorability of the Civil War is not a horribly popular war in the North. And yeah, just to some extent, I suppose, right? You're going to see draft riots from time to time. The largest you're going to see is in New York, in which draft riots are going to happen after the Battle of Gettysburg. During this riot, it's going to last for multiple days. About 120 African Americans are going to be killed, and Lincoln has to take troops from the Battle of Gettysburg and send them to New York to put down that violence. The Confederacy is also going to have conscription acts. They're going to have the draft. And the Confederacy is a little bit different because, after all, the Confederacy was created with this idea of states' rights, and so, or the rights of the individual, right? And so, like, shouldn't they just operate with people's willingness to volunteer? However, as early as April of 1862, we have the Conscription Act, which calls for all able-bodied white men between the ages of 18 and 35 to enroll for the Army for a 3-year term. Um, just like in the North, the rich could get out of it. Exemptions were made for some jobs and for anybody that owned 20 or more slaves. So 20 or more slaves at this point of time would be someone that has holdings of, about $600,000, maybe a little bit more in today's money. So relatively wealthy people, right? Um, so you see that you have, poor people are fighting on both sides when the rich can avoid conflict if they want. The Confederate States of America actually actively sought recognition from other states, other countries like Britain and France. The Confederacy believed that those other countries were so reliant on the export of Southern cotton that they would recognize the South. The miscalculation was that Britain had just gone through a period of labor strikes, and so they had a surplus of cotton that they had to get rid of. And by the time they got through that cotton, that excess, India had become a British colony. They were producing cotton. Excuse me. And the rest of Europe kind of looked at this conflict and they're like, I really don't want to choose sides. The first thing is they didn't want to fight with the United States. They weren't sure if certain areas have the right to leave a union, right? There's also the issue with slavery. By the 1860s, the American South is one of the few places that chattel slavery is being practiced, at least in slavery in large forms is being practiced. And they don't want to get involved in military involvement and military engagement in North America if they don't have to, right? So the Union throughout the war maintains that the Confederacy is in an act of rebellion. Other than a legitimate government, the North actually never declares war on the South. They refer to it as an insurrection or a rebellion because if you declare war on the South, then you recognize them as an independent nation. Okay. The Union's going to wage war on many campaigns in the West. When we say the West, most of the time we're dealing with that area between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains. Although fighting does spill out into Texas, into Missouri, places like that, west of the Mississippi. Okay, Kentucky and Tennessee are places where the fighting in the West originally takes place. Tennessee leaves, Kentucky stays in the Union. At one point, the Confederacy launches an invasion of Kentucky, trying to quote unquote liberate Kentucky, and it goes pretty badly. Kentucky kind of revolts against that, right? Control of the Mississippi River is one of the main goals of the North, and so one of those forts that the South had taken from the North was Fort Henry, and the Union is able to conquer or is able to retake Fort Henry, which opens up Tennessee and Alabama to the Union. After Fort Henry, they moved to Fort Donaldson on the Cumberland River, right? and that's eventually surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant in February of 1862. Right. So Grant's moving down the river systems that are ultimately going to lead to the Mississippi River into the stronghold of Vicksburg. Grant is a little bit different than all of the other Union generals. The other Union generals typically will fight. If there's a bloody fight, if there's a pretty significant fight, then they'll retreat or they'll reorganize. And one of the things that Grant does is he just continues to push forward. An example, this is the Battle of Shiloh, which takes place on April 6th and 7th of 1842. The South kind of catches Grant's army unprepared, and they fight a successful battle against Ulysses S. Grant, which they hadn't had much success against him in on that first day. And the South expected Grant to withdraw and reorganize. And instead, the sun came up on D2, and there was Grant's army ready to fight again and take the fight to the Confederacy. And so the Confederacy was unable to hold the advantage that they had won on day one, and Grant turns a defeat into a victory, which is a huge thing for the North. And we can see here, this is Grant working his way down the Cumberland River. This is the Mississippi River over here. And as Grant conquers all of these areas, there's Donaldson. There was Fort Henry's up in this area up here. And there's Shiloh. And so they're moving their way down through Tennessee, past Memphis. They're separating Memphis from the rest of the South, right? And Grant is being relatively successful in the 1862. Okay, so Grant's working in the West. Lincoln is raising armies in the East. The armies in the East are fighting. The Union armies are not having a whole lot of success. It's important to point out here while we're here is that not all slave states are going to leave the Union. Every state that does leave the Union is a slave state, but not all slave states leave the Union. States like Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware and ultimately West Virginia. West Virginia breaks off of Virginia to stay in the Union, right? States like Kentucky and Missouri form armies or form militias that fight for both sides of the Union and the Confederacy. Maryland during this time frame is placed under martial law during the war. Lincoln suspends the idea of habeas corpus, which is the idea that you can't imprison somebody indefinitely without charging them with a crime. Lincoln goes and rounds up secessionists in Maryland and puts them in jail. He does this because Washington, D.C. is in between Maryland and Virginia. And if Maryland leaves the Union, then the nation's capital would fall into the hands of the Confederacy. Okay, so going back to McDowell and the Battle of Bull Run, the first Battle of Bull Run. After the first Battle of Bull Run, Lincoln replaces General McDowell with General McClellan, right, as leader of the Union forces. And McClellan plans a new strategy to try to win the war. And he comes up with this idea that he's going to use the Navy to transport troops out of Washington, D.C., down into the Chesapeake Bay, and he's going to launch an invasion of Virginia and to capture Richmond and the Confederate capital, right? The plan is horribly unsuccessful. McClellan doesn't move with the speed that a Civil War general needs to at that point. And the Confederates just hassle him the entire time, right? McClellan doesn't reach Richmond. He's driven back by a counteroffensive. Robert E. Lee shows up on the battlefield as commander of the Army of Virginia. And Lee and McClellan fight something known as a 7 days battle. And the Confederacy wins, but they kind of fight to a draw. In reality, the Confederacy loses a ton of troops, so does the North. And Lincoln is kind of horrified with the fighting, and he ultimately calls McClellan back to Washington, D.C. because of some of the movements of Confederate troops that threaten that city, right? Excuse me. So we're all the way into September of 1862. And there we go. We're all the way into September of 1862. And the Union doesn't have a victory on the eastern part of the battlefield in Virginia around Washington D.C. They're winning in the West with Grant, but there's not a whole lot of victories. There's no major victories on the East. Um, Robert E. Lee is now in control of the Army of Virginia, which is the de facto army of the Confederacy, right? He comes up with this plan in order to take some of the pressure off of the South, feeding the armies and whatever, that he wants to invade Maryland. He wants to take the fight to the north. He's hopeful that if he invades Maryland, it will cause an uprising of support for the Confederacy, and Maryland will secede from the Union. He believes that a victory, an offensive victory, would help with this idea of European recognition, that France or England might recognize the Confederacy and therefore force the North to do it also. And they have the outside chance of possibly capturing Washington D.C. and then negotiating peace. Lee marches his army into, excuse me again. Oh my goodness. Lee marches his army into Maryland, and these two armies are going to meet at in Antietam, right by Antietam Creek. The battle itself is a one-day affair. It's the costliest battle of the war. There's over 20,000 casualties at the Battle of Antietam, and they fight to a draw. One of the interesting things is this is a war. This is a battle that probably could have ended the war. One of Lee's subordinate generals was given the battle plans, and he lost them. And the Union happened upon them and found them and took him to McClellan. And McClellan didn't act fast enough to take advantage of these found battle plans. But anyways, Antietam ends up in a draw. The South retreats back into Virginia. McClellan doesn't chase him. One of the interesting things for us at Barton Community College is the Battle of Antietam is the first place that we see Clara Barton, and she brings medical supplies to the battlefield. She goes and tends wounded soldiers. She becomes known as the Angel of the Battlefield, right? She goes on to found the American Red Cross, and she is the namesake of our learning institution here in Great Bend, Kansas. Okay. With the draw at Antietam, Lincoln sees political opportunity, right? Before in 1861, early 1862, Lincoln's argument is that he's trying to preserve the Union, right? He's trying to preserve the Union. The South doesn't have a right to leave, right? And he doesn't have any major victories. He doesn't have any reason to change the focal point of the war. However, with Antietam, Lincoln has a little bit of military momentum, and he sees a chance to change the focus of the war. And so he issues something called the Emancipation Proclamation, which says that, hey, we're going to free all slaves that are present in the states of rebellion, all the slave states that left the Union, on January 1st, 1863. Okay, and so now we're shifting the focus away from the preservation of the Union to ending slavery. All right, and so with that change in focus, the South no longer can. It becomes very unlikely that the South would receive help because of their pro-slavery stance. Okay, McClellan doesn't chase Lee's army after the Battle of Antietam, and Lincoln replaces McClellan's generalship with Admiral Burnside. Burnside faces a huge amount of political pressure. Burnside's not a bad general. He's just not the leader the army needs at this point, right? And so Lincoln's putting a lot of pressure on Burnside to attack. And Burnside chooses Fredericksburg as a place to do that. It's a bad choice because Fredericksburg sits high on a hill. The Confederacy beats Burnside to that spot. They're able to set up a defensive position and force the Union Army to attack their elevated position. and it's just a bloodbath for the North. The North loses twice as many troops as the South, and Burnside shrinks. Eventually, he's going to be replaced in leadership as well. Okay, the question of African American service and leadership or not leadership, but just service in the Union is going to be present. Um, the Union allows freed African Americans to fight and serve in combat roles. One of the first is going to be the First Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry Regiment. They're going to fight at a place called Poison Springs, which is in Arkansas. They're going to suffer. Typically, African American units are going to suffer higher casualty rates because the Confederacy wouldn't accept surrender from the North. The most famous of the African American units are going to be the 54th Massachusetts, um, and that's who the movie Glory was written about. The Confederacy does not accept surrender from the South. We said that. An example, this would be the fight at Fort Pillow in Tennessee, in which Bedford Forrest, who was a cavalry leader for the Confederacy, kills the majority of African American troops that try to surrender. And it's a massacre of African American troops. There we have it. Over 10,000 battles take place in the Civil War. Most of them are either going to be in the Western Theater, which is going to be, again, that area along the Mississippi River, the Mississippi River Delta, the Mississippi River um, Valley, I suppose, right? Areas like Tennessee and Alabama and along Mississippi, and then the Eastern Theater, which is Virginia, in those areas. Although 22 total states see combat, we can see a map here. You can see most of the fighting is going to take place up here. Okay. At the start of the war, we talked about this. Winfield Scott develops the Anaconda Plan, blockade. They're going to try to blockade the main ports of the South to weaken the economy, and to completely cripple the Southern economy. The North needed to control the Mississippi River, right? That Lee's victories throughout the North, almost in every time the North attacked Lee and his army in the South, Lee's victorious, right? The only place he's unsuccessful is when he invades the North. And so following Antietam, you have Fredericksburg, where Lee's victorious. The Union once again attacks Lee, and Lee is victorious again. And so in the summer of 1863, Lee wants to take his forces back into the North and try to take some of the pressure off of Virginia for feeding the army of the South, and even feeding the foraging armies of the South, of the North, as they go into the South, and then also take some of the pressure off of Vicksburg, Mississippi, which has fallen under siege of General Grant. And so he's trying to help out in multiple ways, and he leads his army into Pennsylvania, right? These two armies are actually going to meet by chance in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. What happens in war is sometimes you send out troops to forage and look for food and supplies, and the South is looking for footwear. One of the things the South lacks is factories to build to mass produce shoes and boots for their troops. And Gettysburg, Pennsylvania has a warehouse full of boots, and the Southern Army rolls in. By chance, the Northern Army, the small cavalry unit of the North, is there, and there's a small skirmish, and they fight, and then the South runs the North out of the town. The North ends up on a hillside outside of Gettysburg, and for the next day or so, the word goes out that, hey, this is where the armies are going to meet. And so everybody converges there. The North shows up, the South shows up, and we fight a 2 days battle in 3 days battle in Gettysburg, right? Gettysburg is the most costly battle of the war, over 50,000 casualties. And we have that, right? The Union troops are going to hold the high ground throughout this battle. This is one of the first times that the Union actually has an advantageous geographical advantage in the war. They hold a series of hills outside of Gettysburg. They form in a formation of a fishhook, something like this, like trying to think of an L or fishhook like that. And so for the Union to reinforce, it's a really short distance in between lines. And the South is outside of that fishhook in a similar formation, but they're not able to have interior lines. And so the South, in order to move troops, has to go a lot further of a distance, and we go from there. So the South is basically um, leads a series of attacks on the North. They're unsuccessful on the left flank and on the right flank. On the second day, they try the center, which is Pickett's charge. Lee orders a frontal assault on the center, and it's just a massacre as the troops come out. Right. Lee ultimately withdraws his troops after 3 days of fighting. The Union isn't able to capture them as the Blue Ridge Mountains, um, kind of protect the movement of Lee's army back into the South. And Lincoln is furious at McDowell for that, but he's not uh, his temper, I guess, is relieved in the fact that about the same day, so that's July 1st through the 3rd in 1863. On July 4th, he receives word that Vicksburg, which was the last Southern strong point on the Mississippi River, was captured by Ulysses S. Grant. And the fall of Vicksburg allows the Union total control of Mississippi. The South is now cut in half. Its food sources that were coming from Texas and Arkansas are now prevented from coming across the Mississippi River in large quantities. And um, and Lincoln is able to take his most successful general, which is Ulysses S. Grant, and move him out of the Western Theater and bring him to the East, right? And so we have Vicksburg that takes place. Okay. Ulysses S. Grant is promoted to the general in chief of all Union forces following his victory in the West. When he comes to command in the East, the tactics of the army change. Instead of trying to attack the capital of Richmond or capture the government of the Confederacy, Grant just puts his attention towards destroying General Lee's army. And he's like, look, if I can beat that army, then eventually there's not going to be anything left to stop somebody from going to Richmond or whatever. And so Grant ultimately hopes his ultimate hope is to position his army between Lee's army and Richmond and force Lee to attack him. He's never actually successful in that, but he is successful in constantly moving Lee's army and having these. And so Grant begins this attack on Lee's army with the Battle of the Wilderness, which results in heavy casualties, right? And in the past, after a heavy battle, Union troops would withdraw or they would retreat and reorganize. And instead of that, Grant just pushes his army on. And we can look here at the battle maps of Grant and Lee, and they fight. They fight in the Battle of the Wilderness. They fight at Fredericksburg. They fought at Spotsylvania. They fight at Cold Harbor, and then ultimately they end up fighting in Petersburg, the siege of Petersburg, which is going to lead to Antietam, or no, not Antietam, the surrender of Lee's army at Appomattox Courthouse. Okay, the Battle of Spotsylvania fights both sides suffer heavy losses. In the North, who has a much larger population and a much larger army, can withstand these losses. And Grant is maybe one of the first generals to understand this. Like it's in some ways it's a math game that Grant can lose more troops than Lee can, and he can recover from heavy losses, and Lee can't. Okay, Grant is basically able to outmaneuver Lee's troops and threaten the town of Petersburg. Petersburg is the last rail center that's in service that supplies Richmond, and so the loss of Petersburg would doom the capital. And so the siege of Petersburg takes place. Grant is a military tactician that's not afraid to establish siege type warfare, and he besieges the city of Petersburg from June of 1864 till March of 1865. Lee's army is basically trapped in the town. They're unable to receive reinforcements or resupply, and it's just a matter of waiting, right? In April of 1865, the Confederate Army and the government flee the capital of Richmond. April 4th, Lincoln and President Lincoln and his son Todd, they tour the city of Richmond and the Confederate capital, and they're kind of received as conquering heroes, right? While Lee's army is tied down in Petersburg, General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, who was one of Grant's supporting generals in the West during Vicksburg, and Sherman is rewarded with his own army. Is rewarded with his own army, and Sherman begins to march his forces through the West. Right. Eventually, he attacks Atlanta in May of 1864, besieges Atlanta, burns it to the ground. And Sherman has a couple of different ideas on military tactics. He believes that, obviously the weakest part of an army is its supply line, and so Sherman marches ahead of his supply line if he can, and he has his troops live off the land. And so Sherman, after Atlanta, marches to the sea, and he just disappears. He stops communicating with Washington, D.C. He stops communicating with Grant and Lincoln. And all you hear from about Sherman is, where his armies had been, and they burn everything to the ground, and they steal all the food that they need, and they destroy livestock, and they free slaves, and they do all this. And really, it's to kind of punish the South, but also to give Sherman an advantage, the fact that he can move faster than the supply lines. And so ultimately, Sherman captures Atlanta on September of 1864. Then he takes his troops towards Savannah, and he captures the city of Savannah in December 21st of 1864. And he messages the President Lincoln that he's going to present him the city of Savannah as a Christmas present. Okay. Lee ultimately surrenders his forces to Grant on April 9th of 1865. Right? They meet at Appomattox Courthouse. The terms of surrender are that Lee's troops aren't going to be imprisoned. They're going to be paroled on their own honor. They're going to be allowed to take their livestock back home to plant food in the spring, and that Grant gives Lee some supplies, some rations to feed his army. Right? That's a pretty generous terms. Right? One of the interesting things about this is that the home that is the Appomattox Courthouse, the home that they meet at, was owned by Elmer McLean. And Elmer McLean was a farmer from Manassas, Virginia. And the first Battle of Bull Run is actually fought on some of his property. And he was so horrified by the fighting that he moved as far away as he could from the front lines, thinking that he would protect his family. And ultimately, so the Civil War, the first major battle takes place on his property, and the surrender papers of Lee's army and basically the South take place in his living room. So Elmer McLean. Okay. 5 days after, April 14th, 1865, Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, which is going to throw the North into a little bit of a weird transition, and we'll talk about that. On April 26th, General Johnston's army of Tennessee surrenders to Sherman and outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, and these are the two major armies of the South. Johnston's army and Lee's army, they're both out of the war, and the other generals begin to surrender as well. Right? By May 5th, Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, holds his last meeting of the government, and the Confederacy is dissolved. 5 days later, the Union cavalry troops capture Davis. He's imprisoned for 2 years and ultimately released. And no member of the Confederate government is ever tried for treason. All right, and that's going to get us through the Civil War. It's not a definitely not a complete version of the Civil War. Hitting some highlights. We left out a lot of things, but it gets us where we need to go. So we'll come back and finish this up with Reconstruction next week, and I'll see you guys then. Bye bye. Got to.